Jane Mitchell, the owner of a high-end clothing store in downtown New York, always maintained a firm and demanding attitude with her employees. The store, known for its elitist and discerning clientele, required staff with specific skills and a high level of customer service expertise. When John Walker, a 32-year-old man with a disability, was hired, many questioned Jane's decision. To her, this hiring was more of a test of her authority than an act of inclusion. John, who was once a lover of extreme sports, now moved with the help of a wheelchair, the result of a car accident that had left him paralyzed from the waist down. His arrival at the store was marked by suspicious glances and malicious whispers. Jane, aware of her power and status, treated John with a mix of disdain and superiority, expecting him to fail at his tasks to justify her prejudice. From the very first day, Jane assigned John difficult tasks, organizing stock on high shelves, lifting heavy boxes, and managing deliveries to hard-to-reach locations. She anticipated he would quit quickly. However, to everyone's surprise, John faced each challenge with a subtle smile and unwavering determination. He adapted tools, created mechanisms, and above all, showed an astonishing ability to complete the tasks, even the most complex ones. The work environment, however, was far from welcoming. Colleagues avoided interacting with John, and whispers became constant. Jane, always watching from a distance, made sure to point out any minor mistake, further heightening the tension in the workplace. John remained calm, focused, and resilient. He knew that each day at work was an achievement and proof of his abilities. The mystery surrounding the story was simple. Why had Jane hired someone she clearly despised? Slowly, it became evident that Jane believed hiring John was a way to portray herself as a good and inclusive person in the eyes of the public. But behind appearances, she couldn't stand the idea of someone with limitations working in her prestigious store. And so, the conflict was set. John striving to prove his worth, and Jane waiting for the first slip-up to have an excuse to fire him. The initial tension was established, but something unexpected was about to change the course of this story. Jane's store wasn't just a place to buy clothing. It represented a status that many aspired to reach. Situated in one of New York City's most expensive districts, the glass facade mirrored the sophistication and exclusivity that Jane was determined to uphold. The interior was adorned with Italian marble floors, shelves made of fine wood, and golden mirrors, creating an opulent atmosphere. The sales team, trained to cater to high-end clientele, wore impeccable uniforms and maintained a rigid posture, always ready to serve with a perfected yet artificial smile. However, John's arrival brought a noticeable contrast. His wheelchair, a symbol of accessibility amidst the store's exaggerated luxury, seemed out of place in that environment. Initially, customers appeared uncomfortable at the sight of him, but soon they began to observe him with curiosity. They noticed his ingenious way of organizing the shelves, using extension cords and small improvised pulleys, but it was in customer service where John truly stood out. He knew how to connect with people in a genuine way, with empathy and sensitivity, gradually winning the sympathy of many. One of the most remarkable interactions happened with Mrs. Eleanor, a recurring elderly customer known for her difficult temperament. She always complained about delays and demanded priority service. One day, upon seeing John alone at the counter, she initially ignored him as if he were invisible. But when she needed help finding a specific dress, she had no choice but to speak to him. To her surprise, John knew the store like the back of his hand. He knew exactly where each piece was, and, with immense patience, helped her choose something that pleased her. When Jane saw this, she decided to intervene. She made a point of interrupting their conversation and taking over the service. "He's here to learn," she said in a sharp tone, but Mrs. Eleanor didn't let it slide. "Maybe you should learn from him, dear. Your store has never felt so welcoming before," she retorted, leaving Jane speechless. This episode marked the beginning of a change. The way John handled daily challenges began to attract attention, not only from customers but also from a few colleagues. He transformed the store from a cold and superficial environment into a place where humanity, even if only for brief moments, stood out. Despite this, Jane remained firm in her attitude, but a subtle discomfort arose every time John managed to prove his competence. At the same time, John's past started to come to light. Before the accident, he was an instructor of rock climbing and hiking. The sudden life change and the forced adaptation to living with a disability demanded a strength he never imagined possessing. He was determined not to be defined by his limitations, and every day working at Jane's store was a reminder that he could do more than what others expected of him. As the days went by, the tension between Jane and John grew palpably. The store owner began assigning him even more challenging tasks, clearly designed to make him fail. One day, Jane instructed John to reorganize the entire stockroom in the basement, fully aware that access to the basement was restricted and poorly adapted for his condition. Nevertheless, John accepted the assignment without hesitation, determined not to give her the satisfaction of witnessing his defeat. With meticulous planning, John used a system of ropes and pulleys that he had developed himself to move the heavier boxes. The work sessions, which stretched over several days, were exhausting, but he refused to give up. Each night, he left the store drained, but filled with the satisfaction of having overcome yet another obstacle. To his colleagues, John's dedication began to stand out in an admirable way, and many started to offer him help, albeit discreetly, to avoid Jane noticing. Still, the store owner seemed relentless. When she realized that John was close to completing the work in the stockroom, she told him to redo everything, claiming that the order of the boxes did not meet the store's standards. John bit his lip in frustration, but remained calm. He knew that any sign of rebellion would be interpreted as weakness or disrespect. And that's what Jane was waiting for, something to use as an excuse to fire him. The turning point in the conflict came during a staff meeting, where Jane, in an overly formal tone, began listing the mistakes each employee had made. When she got to John, she made a point of highlighting a series of minor errors he had committed, most of them irrelevant to the overall performance. At the end of her speech, Jane looked directly at John, as if daring him to respond. "Do you have anything to say, John?" she taunted, a cynical smile on her face. For a moment, the room was completely silent. All eyes were on John. He took a deep breath, lifted his head, and with surprising calmness replied, "Yes, I do. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to learn and grow here. I'm grateful for the challenges because they've taught me to be more creative and resilient than I ever imagined I could be." Jane, taken aback, tried to cut him off, but he continued, "If I've made many mistakes, it's because I'm always trying to go beyond my limits, not to prove something to anyone else, but to prove to myself that I can do this, that we can all do whatever we set our minds to." There was a brief moment of silence until, unexpectedly, some colleagues applauded. Jane was visibly shaken. This was a response she hadn't anticipated. Instead of diminishing John's morale, the meeting ended up boosting his standing among his colleagues. From that moment on, Jane began to feel like she was losing the control she so highly valued. A few days later, an unexpected event further shook the dynamics. Jane's daughter, Sarah, was in a serious car accident and was rushed to the hospital. Jane, desperate and anxious, spent sleepless nights at the hospital, awaiting news of Sarah's recovery, who urgently needed a blood transfusion. When Jane arrived at the hospital in a devastated emotional state, she was informed by one of the doctors that a compatible donor had come forward. Surprised and relieved, she went to the waiting room where, to her utter disbelief, she found John waiting to be taken to the collection room. He had volunteered as soon as he heard about the incident from one of the colleagues. Why are you doing this?" Jane asked, her voice breaking with emotion and confusion. John looked at her seriously. "Because I know what it's like to lose something important in life. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even you." Jane felt a mix of shame, guilt, and gratitude. This man, whom she had despised and tried to humiliate in every possible way, was standing there, offering to save her daughter's life. The shock of the situation made her reflect deeply on her actions and prejudices. For the first time, Jane found herself speechless. She simply stood there in silence, watching as John was taken in for the donation. From that moment on, the dynamic between them changed irreversibly. After the incident at the hospital, Jane decided to step away from the store for a few days to closely monitor Sarah's recovery. During this time, John took on more responsibilities at the store with the support of some colleagues who were inspired by his attitude and resilience. He demonstrated a level of organization and leadership that no one had expected, ensuring that everything continued to run smoothly. Meanwhile, other staff members began to question Jane's true intentions when hiring John. One of the senior employees, Karen, confided in a colleague during a private conversation that Jane had once mentioned she wanted to use John as an example of overcoming adversity to attract positive attention to the store. Karen, who had initially remained neutral regarding John's treatment, now felt uncomfortable with the manipulation of the situation. Additionally, one of the store's regular suppliers, Mark, who had been observing John in action, decided to present him with an unexpected offer. Mark ran a company that promoted the inclusion of people with disabilities in the workforce and suggested that John participate in an upcoming event in Los Angeles focused on discussing accessibility and inclusion in the fashion industry. John was taken aback, but also flattered by the invitation. When Jane returned to the store, she found a different atmosphere. The tension that had once filled the air seemed to have dissipated. Employees who previously avoided John were now engaging with him openly, exchanging ideas and seeking ways to make the store more accessible and inclusive. Jane realized that, in her absence, John had earned the trust and respect of everyone, something she had never expected. Witnessing this change, Jane began to reassess her position. She recalled John's words at the hospital and the sacrifice he was willing to make for someone he barely knew. As much as she tried to maintain a firm stance, Jane couldn't ignore the growing sense of guilt inside her. Did she truly believe that someone like John had no value for her store? Or was it simply a reflection of her own fears and prejudices? These questions began to consume her thoughts, marking the beginning of an internal transformation she never imagined she would undergo. Jane's internal transformation, which had started with the incident at the hospital and intensified by John's success at the store during her absence, reached its climax with an unexpected event. One day, the store was visited by a renowned fashion and inclusion critic, David Reynolds, who had learned about John's presence through a social media post by Mark, the supplier. David was known for his sharp eye and for exposing inclusion practices that were mere window dressing, as he often put it. Jane, who always prioritized appearances, felt a surge of anxiety at the thought of David's visit. She was fully aware that John had initially been hired merely as a token of inclusion, and she feared that David would see right through it. However, the visit took a turn that Jane could never have anticipated. David entered the store and, without any formalities, immediately began speaking with John, completely ignoring Jane. He wanted to know all the details about what it was like working there, the challenges John faced, and his thoughts on accessibility and inclusion in the workplace. John, with his usual calm demeanor, answered honestly. He highlighted the initial difficulties and the hostile environment he had encountered, but also mentioned how the team's attitude had begun to shift and how he felt he was gradually earning his place. David listened intently and at the end turned to Jane. It's rare to find a luxury store that genuinely values inclusion, but it's even rarer to see the team adapt and start transforming the environment. "You must be proud of this, Jane," he said, his tone almost teasing. Jane felt a lump in her throat. She knew this was her opportunity to reinforce the positive image of her store and maintain appearances. However, something inside her had changed. Maybe it was the way John looked at her, observing calmly, as if he understood the internal struggle she was facing at that moment. For the first time, she allowed herself to be honest. "David, to be truthful, I didn't start this process with the right intentions. In the beginning, I hired John for all the wrong reasons, and I'm not proud of that. But he's changed the way I see a lot of things. In reality, it was he who transformed this environment, not me, and I think I still have a lot to learn." The store fell into silence after that statement. The employees, who had been eavesdropping on the conversation, could hardly believe what they were hearing. John, surprised, noticed the sincerity in Jane's words. David, visibly intrigued, simply smiled and jotted down a few notes in his notebook. This moment marked a complete shift in the dynamic between Jane and John. She, who once saw him only as a means to promote the store, now recognized him as a competent professional and a person worthy of respect. And John, in turn, began to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, Jane was truly capable of change. This was not just a turning point for Jane, but for the entire store. Her admission of guilt and acceptance of personal growth set an example for everyone. It showed that transformation is possible even in the most unexpected of places. And it all starts with a willingness to confront one's own flaws and biases. After that day, Jane's behavior took a noticeable turn. Store meetings, which had once focused on pointing out mistakes and imposing rules, were now moments of exchange and collaboration. She began to listen more attentively to John's ideas and those of the other employees, seeking to implement changes that would make the environment more inclusive and welcoming. One of Jane's first actions was to hire a specialized consulting firm in accessibility and inclusion to reassess the store's structure. Ramps were installed in all accessible areas, and the shelves were reorganized to allow people in wheelchairs to move freely throughout the space. To everyone's surprise, Jane also decided to start a training program for the entire team, focusing on awareness and inclusive customer service. As these changes were being implemented, Jane couldn't avoid a growing sense of guilt. She knew she was trying to make up for the mistakes of the past, particularly for all the humiliation that John had endured. Every conversation and every new adaptation made her reflect on her previous attitudes and prejudices. It was as if, with each step, she was rebuilding something she herself had broken. John, on the other hand, observed Jane's transformation with caution. Although he acknowledged the genuine effort she was putting in, he couldn't help but wonder how much of this change was authentic, or simply a way for her to redeem herself. The other employees, now closer to John, also commented on Jane's actions. Some were skeptical, while others were hopeful that this transformation would be long-lasting. But the true impact of these changes became evident when Jane's daughter, Sarah, finally recovered and visited the store for the first time since the accident. Noticing the alterations in the environment and the way everyone seemed to work in harmony, Sarah was taken aback. "Mom, the store looks different. Better, I'd say," she remarked. Jane smiled, but her eyes soon shifted to John, who was helping a customer. "He's the one who brought about this change, Sarah. He's the one who showed me I was wrong in so many ways." Still surprised, Sarah walked over to John and thanked him for helping to save her life. "I'm grateful to you, John. My mom told me everything that happened. I want you to know that what you did was incredible, and that you are an incredible person," Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion. John, slightly embarrassed by the praise, smiled and responded humbly, "I just did what I thought was right. I didn't do it expecting anything in return." Sarah nodded, and Jane watched the scene, deeply moved. It was as if, in that moment, all the conflicts and misunderstandings were dissolved by a shared feeling of mutual understanding and respect. Jane knew she still had a lot to learn, and that her journey of transformation was only just beginning. After this episode, the store's reputation spread throughout the city. John's name was mentioned in several local publications as an example of resilience and competence, and Jane, who had once been reluctant to embrace true inclusion, began using her store as a platform to promote diversity in the workforce. The relationship between Jane and John was still somewhat formal, but both knew that something fundamental had changed. The respect, which had once been one-sided, was now mutual, and that, more than any physical modifications to the store, was the most significant change of all. As word spread, customers began visiting the store not only for its exclusive products, but also to witness the changes they had heard about. Jane's store, once an epitome of exclusivity and rigidity, was slowly becoming a symbol of openness and inclusivity. Journalists, bloggers, and even business leaders started to take notice, turning Jane's shop into a case study for the potential of change within a business. And while Jane continued to manage the store with her signature style, she also allowed space for John to take on a more prominent role, consulting with him on decisions that would affect the store's inclusiveness. For the first time, Jane felt pride not in the luxury of her store, but in its capacity to welcome and adapt. And John, who had once been viewed as a mere pawn in her plans, was now a central pillar in the store's newfound identity. Together, they had transformed a place of rigid exclusivity into one of genuine inclusion, and the city was taking notice. As the months passed, John began receiving invitations to speak about his experiences and how workplace inclusion can benefit both employees and companies. He became a living example of perseverance and resilience, and gradually realized that his presence at Jane's store was making a much bigger impact than he initially imagined. His work and dedication not only transformed Jane's store, but also inspired other business owners in the area to rethink their hiring and inclusion practices. Jane, who had once been completely resistant to change, became an active advocate for inclusion in the workplace. With John's help, she organized an event at the store, inviting companies and industry professionals to discuss accessibility and best inclusion practices. What initially seemed like a small gathering grew in scope and attracted the attention of important figures in the New York fashion scene. During the event, Jane took the stage and shared her story with raw honesty. She openly talked about how she began the process of hiring John with selfish and prejudiced intentions, but how, over time, her outlook completely changed. "I'm not here to seek redemption," she said in a moment of vulnerability. "I'm here to learn and to share how incredible people like John can teach us more than we ever imagined." When John was invited to speak, he hesitated at first. He didn't like being the center of attention, but he understood that his story could help break down barriers and prejudices. He spoke about the accident that changed his life and how finding purpose amid chaos had been the key to overcoming his limitations. "It's not about charity or giving someone an opportunity out of pity," John stated firmly. "It's about recognizing people's potential and giving them a real chance to show what they're capable of." John's words had a profound impact on everyone present. The event not only changed the perspective of many business owners, but also sparked a new sense of hope and determination in Jane. She, who once viewed her store solely as a business, now saw it as a platform to promote social change. After the event, Jane asked John to join her for a private conversation. "I know the store was never the right place for you," she began sincerely, "but I would love for you to stay and help me transform this into something bigger than just a clothing store." John, deeply moved by the offer, took a moment to reflect. "I'm not sure what my next step is, but I know I want to keep making a difference. Let's figure out how to do that together." And so, they sealed a new chapter of collaboration, one built on mutual respect and a shared desire to create positive change in the world. From that moment on, Jane and John worked side by side, shaping the store into a symbol of true inclusion. They introduced new policies, partnered with organizations dedicated to workplace diversity, and turned the store into a training ground for other businesses looking to implement inclusive practices. Jane's store, once a place known only for its exclusivity, became a beacon of hope and inspiration for others. And John, who had once been seen as just a means to an end, was now a key figure in this transformation, not just in Jane's store, but across the community. Their journey showed that overcoming prejudice and growing together is possible when people are willing to see beyond their preconceived notions and work towards something greater. In the end, it wasn't just the store that changed. It was the hearts and minds of everyone involved, and that, more than any sale or profit, was the true success they had achieved. With John's rising popularity and the success of the event organized by Jane, the store became a focal point for discussions on inclusion and accessibility in New York. However, the increased visibility also brought new challenges and pressures for both of them. Journalists and critics began questioning whether the changes were truly genuine or just a marketing strategy to promote the business. One cold winter morning, Jane received a formal letter from a group of business leaders who organized the city's most important annual fashion event. They invited her to participate in a panel on inclusive practices, alongside other prominent industry figures. The offer seemed promising, but there was one detail that troubled her. The invitation was addressed solely to her, with no mention of John. Feeling that this was a slight against the pivotal role John had played in her personal and professional transformation, Jane was unsure whether to accept. It was an opportunity to solidify her reputation and attract even more attention to the store. Yet she knew that without John by her side, it wouldn't have the same meaning. She decided to talk to John about the situation. As she explained her concerns and the nature of the invitation, she expected to see some form of resentment or frustration in his expression. But as always, John surprised her. "I understand they want to hear your perspective, Jane. After all, it's your store and your story of change. You deserve to be on that panel," he said calmly. "But if I could suggest something different, why don't we propose an alternative? How about you share the stage with me? That way." The group hesitated at first, but the unconventional proposal generated positive buzz, and they ultimately agreed. News that Jane and John would be sharing the stage quickly spread, generating anticipation about how they would address the topic of inclusion and accessibility in the corporate world. On the day of the event, the auditorium was packed. Journalists, business leaders, and social activists eagerly awaited what Jane and John had to say. The lights dimmed, and the two of them walked onto the stage together. Jane began her presentation with a heartfelt and emotional speech about the profound impact John had had on her life and the business. She spoke openly about her initial prejudice and how, through John's perseverance and resilience, she had learned to see beyond appearances and embrace true change. Then, John took over, speaking with clarity and empathy about how inclusion must go beyond words and one-off actions. He highlighted the importance of seeing people's potential and providing them with real opportunities to contribute meaningfully. With each word, the atmosphere in the room grew more intense, setting the stage for the most decisive moment in their journey. The audience could feel the gravity of the transformation they had undergone, not only as individuals, but also as a business that dared to challenge the status quo. Jane looked at John as he spoke, and for the first time in a long while, she felt not just pride in the business they had built together, but a deep respect for the man who had taught her the true meaning of inclusion. This was no longer just about the store or her reputation. It was about changing minds, hearts, and ultimately the world around them. The room was silent, captivated by the sincerity and strength of their words. They had shared the stage, but more importantly, they had shared a vision, one that was now unfolding before the eyes of an eager audience, waiting to see what would come next. As Jane and John continued their speeches on stage, the audience remained in complete silence, absorbing every word. The emotions were palpable, and the atmosphere was one of deep reflection and admiration for their journey. However, just as Jane finished recounting how John had been instrumental in transforming her store and her own views on inclusion, a reporter in the back of the room stood up and asked a question that shifted the entire direction of the presentation. "Jane, you mentioned that hiring John started with selfish and prejudiced intentions. How can we trust that the changes made in your store and your participation in this event aren't just an opportunistic move to promote your image and your business?" The room fell into a deafening silence. All eyes turned to Jane, who appeared caught off guard. She took a deep breath. She felt the weight of the question and the truth behind it. It was a fair question, one she had asked herself countless times. Jane looked at John, seeking some form of guidance, but found only a look of encouragement. She knew this was the moment to be more honest than ever before. "I understand your doubt, and I agree that it's difficult for anyone to believe that such profound changes are genuine. The truth is, I started this process for all the wrong reasons, and because of that, I've often questioned whether I had the right to claim any credit," Jane began, her voice slightly trembling. "But what I've learned from John, and from this entire experience, is that true transformation doesn't happen overnight. It requires humility, acknowledgement of one's own mistakes, and a willingness to learn from others." Before the reporter could respond, John took the microphone. "I had my doubts about Jane's intentions at the beginning too, but I watched day after day as she began to change. I saw her actions speak louder than any speech. She didn't just improve the conditions at the store. She actively engaged to ensure that more people like me had opportunities in other companies as well. And that's not something you do just to look good." John paused, scanning the audience. "We're not here to convince anyone. We're here to show that change is possible, even if it starts imperfectly. What matters is how you choose to move forward. And I chose to stand by Jane because I believe she has truly changed." The reporter, visibly moved by John's response, nodded respectfully. The tension in the room eased, and the panel continued with more questions, though none carried the same emotional weight. Jane felt both relieved and aware that this was just the beginning of a long path to regaining people's trust. When the panel concluded, Jane and John received a standing ovation. It was recognition not only for what they had said, but for their courage in exposing their vulnerabilities and facing criticism openly. However, the true climax occurred afterward, during the audience Q&A session. A woman in the audience, visibly emotional, stood up to speak. "I'm the mother of a child with a disability. For years, I've watched my son be rejected from various schools and environments. Today, seeing you both here has given me hope. Hope that one day he will find a place where he is accepted and respected. I just want to say thank you, Jane, and thank you, John, for giving me this gift of hope. Jane, struggling to hold back tears, expressed her deepest gratitude. The entire room was moved by the woman's testimony, and John, equally touched, approached her to offer words of support. In that moment, they realized that what they were doing was far bigger than they had ever imagined. It was more than just a store or a matter of reputation. They were inspiring people and demonstrating that true inclusion begins with small acts of change and acceptance. As the event came to an end, Jane and John left the stage to a shower of applause. Jane knew that this was the pinnacle of her journey, not as a businesswoman, but as someone who had learned to genuinely see the value in people. And John, once again, proved that with perseverance and courage, it's possible to not only change one's own life, but also the lives of those around you. They walked off the stage, side by side, knowing that what they had built together was not just a business relationship, but a partnership rooted in mutual respect and a shared mission. The event had been a success, but more importantly, it had marked a turning point. Not only for Jane and John, but for everyone in that room who had witnessed the power of true transformation. After the event, Jane and John's lives took unexpected but equally inspiring turns. Their presentation at the panel generated enormous buzz in the business community and the media. The story of how a prejudiced and self-centered businesswoman transformed into an advocate for inclusion, guided by the example and perseverance of an employee with a disability, became a powerful symbol of hope and change. In the months that followed, Jane implemented new policies at the store, making it not only accessible but truly welcoming to everyone. The team, inspired by Jane's journey of transformation and John's unwavering attitude, began participating in community initiatives and events on workplace inclusion. Gradually, Jane's store ceased to be just another luxury clothing retailer and started being recognized as a model of social responsibility and commitment to diversity. John, meanwhile, began receiving invitations to speak in other cities and even other countries about his experience. His perspective on inclusion and accessibility in corporate settings sparked interest in companies eager to change their practices, but unsure where to start. He took on a role as an inclusion consultant, helping organizations create fairer and more equitable environments for people with disabilities. Despite his success, John always maintained a special connection with Jane's store. Even while traveling for speaking engagements and conferences, he always found time to return and visit the place where it all began. For him, the store represented a symbol of overcoming challenges, not only for everything he had faced, but also for all the ways Jane had managed to change herself. In the end, Jane decided to take an even bolder step. Inspired by the positive impact John had on her life and her business, she announced the opening of a new store in Los Angeles, where the focus would be on the complete inclusion of people with disabilities in the fashion industry. The store, named Inclusion in Fashion, would be managed by John and a former colleague he had mentioned at the beginning of his journey. The project quickly gained national attention, becoming a milestone in the industry. At the grand opening of the new store, Jane and John spoke together once again. Jane shared how a mistake can become an opportunity for learning and growth, and how she was still in a constant process of change. John, on the other hand, emphasized that true inclusion happens when everyone, regardless of their circumstances, has the chance to showcase their worth and be respected for who they are. With a sincere hug, Jane and John concluded the event, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Jane, now more humble and aware of her role as a business leader, and John, more determined than ever to promote inclusion in all areas. The Los Angeles store quickly became a success, attracting the attention of other entrepreneurs and consumers interested in a more inclusive and welcoming future. And so, What had begun as an act of prejudice and disdain transformed into a powerful example of how empathy and respect can change lives. Not only for those who are included, but also for those who learn to include. Their story became a testament to the power of human connection, proving that real change often starts with small steps and courageous conversations. As the years went by, Jane's and John's partnership continued to inspire, serving as a reminder that no matter how deeply rooted prejudices may be, the willingness to learn and grow can lead to profound transformation. For Jane, what started as a business decision ended as a journey of self-discovery and a new understanding of the world around her. For John, what started as a personal challenge became a mission to change the corporate world's view of inclusion. Together, they showed that true success is not just measured in profit or prestige, but in the ability to leave a positive and lasting impact on people's lives. Months after the grand opening of the new store in Los Angeles, Jane and John reunited at an event where John was awarded for his contributions to workplace inclusion. As the applause echoed throughout the hall, Jane approached him and whispered, "You changed my life in ways I never imagined." John smiled and replied, "And you changed mine." Inclusion goes far beyond the workplace. It's about seeing each other as equals. With one last hug, they parted ways, each following their own path, united by a friendship and respect that transcended any differences. Jane and John's story shows us that true inclusion starts when we set aside our prejudices and make room to learn from one another. May this narrative inspire businesses and individuals to create more inclusive environments where every person is valued for their skills and potential. Share this story with someone you think could benefit from this lesson in empathy and respect. Together, we can build a world where everyone has the opportunity to shine, regardless of their limitations or differences.